So you're getting ready to install coilovers on your Toyota GR86 or Subaru BRZ. All right, so we've got one front and one rear 500 series coilover from Fortunato. You have the locking collars here, a 4mm on one and a 5mm on the other. So to set preload, it's pretty straightforward. All that you're going to want to do, we're going to start with the front here. Take your tape measure, place it right against the spring isolator here at the top. This will be plastic or rubber depending on your application. And then just measure to the spring isolator here at the bottom, so you're only measuring the length of the spring. So this reads right here at 6 3/4 inches, which means this 7-inch spring has been compressed to 1/4 inch, so that one's good to go. To verify that that's set, just take your 5mm Allen key or T-handle, put in the lock, and just make sure that it's snug. Good to go. On these, you'll do the same thing. You'll just put that tape measure up against that spring isolator. Same with the bottom, just read the top of the spring isolator. We see here, we've got 6 7/8 inches, meaning that this 7-inch spring has been compressed 1/8 of an inch, and we're all set. Same as before, take your 5mm, lock that in, make sure it's snug, good to go. To set your ride height, just measure here from the bottom of the top hat. And I like to measure to a consistent point here, which is just the top of the lower mount. So you just verify whatever that measurement is that you want to start at. Verify that the left and right ones are the same from this lower point of the top hat to the top of the lower mount. Once they are, take the smaller of your two spanners. Make sure that is snug. And when it is snug, take your 4mm, lock it in place. Now the front's a little bit different. We do have this camber adjustable top plate here with the pillow ball housing, and then beneath that we have our radial bearing. The easiest thing to do for measuring the height of your front coilover, if it does have an adjustable top plate like this, if you measure from the top plate, this can be a little bit different because this spherical bearing allows for rotation of the top plate. So you might measure from this side to the lower mount. It would be different than if you measured from this side to the lower mount. So to measure off of a level plane, I like to measure right here from this lip on the radial bearing because that's going to be flush, it's going to be flat with the spring. And then same as before, we just measure a point down here to the top of the lower mount. Once you're happy with that, just make sure that that is the same left and right. Same as before. Take the smaller of the two spanner wrenches, crank that down. Once it's tight, take your 4mm, lock it in place. Now you're ready to install. So just got these little clips for the wheel speed sensor, ABS line, got my hose out. You're going to do these after taking the knuckle bolts off. Otherwise, you'll have the whole knuckle hanging from one of these M8s and it will break. Now we're ready to install. You'll see this flat part here will face in towards the body. It'll be pretty obvious. The lower mount will match, so you'll be able to tell which is left and right, but just to be safe, make sure that flat part is facing in towards the body. So just rotate that around. Then all we'll do here is just pop this up, and we'll just put that up in there. just take this, you can either jack it up with a jack or like an auxiliary jack, or just pick it up by hand. These knuckles aren't very heavy. They'll be even lighter if you have a BRZ where they're aluminum. But you just want to make sure that the damper, the lower mount here on the coilover is lined up, and then just get that in place. And it's a simple case of push up and then just align the bolts and pop them in. Important thing to note here, you'll have a slot here at the top, so you can do a little tiny bit of camber correction on these. I usually tend to have it all the way, one way or the other. Just grab your impact. In this case, I'm going to pull mine all the way out to the maxed out position here on the top one. Just put your box end on one side and just zap them on really quickly just to make sure it stays in place. You can do the same for the bottom. Just one little tap to make sure they're static, and then you can torque them to spec. Since the BRZ uses an aluminum knuckle, it'll have a slightly lower torque spec. This is what happens if you run like a longer end link or the OEM end link with a coilover system like this, where the lower mount has the sway bar end link tab lower than the factory location. You can actually see that it pushes the sway bar into the lower control arm here, which is not safe. So we're gonna make sure that these are adjusted appropriately and then installed. And just thread that on there with the reducer washer. And then same here. Thread it on there with the reducer washer. Once you've got the sway bar end links tightened on, just attach your wheel speed sensor line here. That just clips into the bracket just like it does on the stock suspension. And then same here, you'll just return your brake line bracket to the little retainer over here and just put the bolt back in. Be aware these are aftermarket braided stainless steel brake lines, so the fitment on the bracket here may differ slightly from the OEM bracket. Zap. All right, moving on to the rear. This is simpler by far. So first we're gonna hop into the trunk. As you can see, we've already removed our side liners, but that is just a few clips. They kind of pop in here, and then once those are out, all you really have to do is just fold this section of the lower trunk liner back, and then just undo these two 14 mil bolts. For the outer, you're going to want to loosen it, but you don't necessarily have to remove it all the way. Same with the inner, you're just going to want to loosen it. The reason for this is if you do not loosen it and you lower the car significantly beyond stock, you'll have that bushing bound up here on the inside and the outside, and it's best to unload those to maintain no additional tension or binding after you change the ride height and alignment of the car. I just have my 14 mil here. I will just pop the lower coilover eyelet bolt out. At this point, if you are installing a rear lower control arm, you can just take all the bolts off and it'll just make the whole coilover assembly kind of fall out. I'm not going to be doing that. So I will just wiggle this free by putting some pressure on the knuckle. And I'm just going to use a little leverage to just wiggle it sideways so that it can be more easily popped out. Okay. Yeah, once you pop that out, that's it. It's out. So we'll supply these with a little zip tie on them or twist tie to keep the bushing spacers in if it's a Heim joint. For prototyping, this one does have a Heim joint, but if it's a 500, it will ship with a a nice rubber bushing in the bottom so it won't make a bunch of noise. What you're going to want to do is just make sure that everything is lined up. So you want to have the bolt axis going parallel with the axis of the lower mount. Once that's done, and since this one is adjusted to be a lot shorter than the OEM mount, we can just kind of pop it down in there and let it rest. But then we can just take our lower coilover bolt here, pass it through the lower eyelet. Eventually, it'll just kind of wiggle in place. And it can kind of sit in there. So you want to make sure that these bushings are all in their ride height position before they're torqued to spec. If you don't, things can get bound at a certain angle or misalignment, and that can lead to them shifting over time or potentially damaging the bushings or the lower control arm in the process of driving around after that. Some of the issues that can occur here is it can be clunking or clacking can happen if these are installed at a slight angle, and then when you set the car down they kind of like pop back into alignment, but then there's a gap because they weren't torqued with the bushings in the correct alignment. Again, to mitigate this, we will torque these to spec with the car at or near ride height to make sure that no misalignment can happen as a result of these being just hanging freely in the air with no weight on them. So I'm just jacking up the lower control arm here to push those upper bolts up into the car. Okay, great. Now you have coilovers on your car. If you have any questions that weren't addressed in this video, or if your car isn't a GR86, which we referenced here, make sure that you reference the installation guide that's provided to you either in paper form or in a QR code in your set. If you have any questions that aren't answered in this video or in that installation guide, please send us an email at sales@fortune-auto.com, and we'll be happy to send you any additional information you may require.